been most kind to not only call me to Goa, but to say so many kind things that I am sometimes afraid that maybe I may not live up to all that has been promised. But as many lawyers are, we like to describe ourselves as promising young men. We are forever promising. And in a sense, the question of has the judiciary failed is that same question of a promise. What is it that was a promise that was envisioned in our constitution? The mission statement that they set themselves to be, and have they lived up to the promise? And will they live up to the promise as times grow tougher? What I propose to do is to give all of you a brief outline of how the story has developed of the judiciary in independent India. Because from there maybe we can continue the story in our own minds and figure out whether that promise is likely to be upheld, whether that tryst with destiny is to continue, or are we marching furiously fast backwards into a glorious past. So, see, the judiciary or the judicial system comes as Professor Devi said, from the English, and then at the time of independence what we basically did was to take the existing judiciary and then tell them that along with all your routine transfer of property, your criminal law and all that, you now have a new book to construe, the Constitution of India. Now the Constitution of India was in large parts just the mechanics of how to run a government. That was the Government of India Act. But on to that, we added a vision statement. A vision statement in our preamble which promised liberty, equality and fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual. We also had our constitutional guarantees as citizens, which were our fundamental rights. We also had a vision statement for the state that this was the general direction in which we would run this nation. And that was assigned to a judiciary, which I told you was largely consisted of people who had been appointed previously by the British government and then they were to continue. So the first Chief Justice of India was Justice Kania, and though Pandit Nehru had some reservations, he said yes, but Kania becomes Chief Justice of India only because one man refused, and refused for what to my mind today looks like an extraordinarily stupid reason. It was the revered Justice Chagla. He was Chief Justice of Bombay at the time of independence. He was offered the Chief Justiceship of India, but he refused it because the Chief Justice of Bombay, appointed by the British, had pay protection and his salary would have been cut if he had joined the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. Then later on, when Justice Kania suddenly died in office, the offer was again made to Justice Chagla, come and become Chief Justice. But by then, the judges who had already been appointed, that led by the senior most, Justice Patanjali Shastri, said no, you can't now get an outsider. If you get somebody else, we will all resign. So that was the first instance where the judges stood up to the government of the day, but it did the right thing. Because with that resistance, there came in the first signs of bureaucratization of the judiciary. Your seniority was everything. Your seniority determined whether, when you joined the Supreme Court, as to whether you would be Chief Justice or you would not be Chief Justice. And it also then established a hierarchy. The Chief Justice was no more just primus inter partes or the first among equals. The Chief Justice was the Chief Justice. And so, what should have been an institutional solution became very personalized. To control the institution, it became very easy to control the Chief Justice. And that is a game that the governments throughout our constitution, throughout our experience as a republic, have been very adept at. Mind you, the people who have gone on to be Chief Justice of India, most of them have maintained an absolutely clear, pure, private integrity. But they are all human. They all have families. And there are weaknesses somewhere or the other which every government probes in, every government pries, and every government then keeps the institution under control through the office of the Chief Justice. So, the vision statement at that point of time was set by the same Justice Patanjali Shastri in a judgment called B.G. Rao, where he said, if then the courts in this country face up to such important and none too easy task, it is not out of any desire to tilt at the legislative authority in a crusader spirit, but in discharge of a duty plainly laid upon them by the Constitution. This is especially true as regards the fundamental rights, as to which this court has been assigned the role of a sentinel on the qui vive. A sentinel on the qui vive is a phrase I've been trying to figure out where Justice Patanjali Shastri got it, and the nearest I can guess is something out of Walter Scott. A sentinel on the qui vive is somebody who stands guard and asks for the password if anybody comes up. And the password being Vive le Roy, long live the king. Qui vive, who, which king? And that is how you identified whether it was friend or foe, and either you have to strike him down or allow him in. So the sentinel on the qui vive has become a kind of formula. From a literary phrase, it has become a legal formula which has been invoked time and again by the Supreme Court. We are on the qui vive to defend the citizens' fundamental rights. But sentinels are also human, like judges. Sentinels also sleep. Sentinels can get bored. Sentinels sometimes decide not to see things. And that is when citadels fall. Citadels fall from within always. And so, we had the early years of Nehru, where a court was interpreting a new vision document for the country. Each of those phrases was given new life, a pran pratishta of a book was happening, and the real fundamental fight at that point of time was about the fundamental right to property. We were a poor country. There had to be redistribution, especially of agricultural land. But we did not really have the money to pay adequate compensation. So there was a whole series of case laws where they said, yes, you must give compensation, but that compensation need not necessarily be commensurate, etc., etc., etc. And the fundamental right to property was in that sense being hollowed out. These fights over property rights then go on into the era of Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, where Indira Gandhi then was looking for a socialistic pattern of society, and at the same point of time, she said we need a committed judiciary. A judiciary which is committed to our economic path, which is not too fixated on property rights, and that is where the desire to get a judiciary made to measure came in. Some people were overlooked for promotions, some people were pushed up, and it all led to this great crisis of 1973, where the Supreme Court finally, while grappling with the question as to which parts of the Constitution could be amended and which parts couldn't, coincidentally, we are near its anniversary. On 23rd of April 1973, two things happened. One was that the Supreme Court, 24th, the Supreme Court came out in the Keshavananda Bharati case with the doctrine of basic structure, which said that you can amend any part of the Constitution, but you can only amend it. You can't change its basic structure. The second thing that happened, and these two things I often say held India together. The second thing that happened that day was that Sachin Tendulkar was born. So, between Tendulkar and the doctrine of basic structure, there were several things which came together where the court at least held together a country despite what was soon to follow. The next day after this judgment, 3 of the senior judges were superseded. They were to have become Chief Justice of India in turn on the seniority principle. The government said no. The judges resigned, and Justice A. N. Ray then became Chief Justice of India. 2 years later, you had the Allahabad High Court, which overturned Mrs. Gandhi's election. She then imposed an emergency, came to the Supreme Court, got a stay, and then finally even her election was upheld. But in those emergency years, the same kind of judiciary made to order, or nudged to order, or cut down to size, actually went on to say that your right to life itself was only a gift of the Constitution. That you had a fundamental right to life, and if that right to life was suspended in an emergency, then there was no possibility of legal relief, and that the government could do it. That was the judgment in ADM Jabalpur, a judgment delivered by a 4:1 by a bench where the only dissenter was Justice H.R. Khanna. And Justice H.R. Khanna, when he wrote that judgment, told his sister that I have written a judgment which will cost me the Chief Justiceship of India. But he stood there. And that is why his portrait today even hangs in the in courtroom number 2, the court that he retired from. And it is a curious thing, I'm getting ahead of the story here. But it was Justice Y.D. Chandrachud who was in the majority, who said you don't have a fundamental right to life, who later said that I wish I had the courage to resign before giving that judgment. He apologized. Today, as I speak, Justice Y.D. Chandrachud's son and Justice Khanna's nephew our Chief Justice of India and the next Chief Justice of India. So we have a tradition of men and women of law who have, in the past 75 years of the Republic, built gharanas. I'm not saying it in a pejorative fashion. They have built legal traditions, they have built gharanas, and they have known what it is to be on the wrong side of history or on the right side of history. Now, moving on from the days of the emergency, and when the emergency was lifted after elections, the other judge who was in the majority was Justice Bhagwati, who then said that we have to redeem ourselves. And how do we redeem ourselves? He then came about with the expansion of public interest litigation, where he said that we shall hear the lost, the last and the least, and things which came in newspapers, things which were brought to his attention, he had the court intervene. But public interest litigation, while it was a good thing to begin with, expanded so much that there was always the thought that there was judicial overreach. There was also the possibility that the administration would just sit on its hands and say that, okay, let the judges pass an order, then we know what to implement it. The position from Justice Bhagwati's days towards the second Indira Gandhi government then morphs into a government with a huge majority. That was the 1984 elections, after which Rajiv Gandhi came with a 400-seat majority. And at that point of time came a situation where the court thought it was just interpreting the law. In the Shah Banu case, the court said that yes, there may be personal law, but the criminal law, under the Criminal Procedure Code, a woman is entitled to maintenance irrespective of what religion she or her husband follows. There was resistance from the Muslim clerics, and the community joined in, and that is when the Parliament passed an act called the Muslim Women's Protection on Divorce Act, which took away the force of the Shah Banu judgment. The law norm is that courts can declare what the law is based on the law as it then stands, as it was interpreted. But if you can take away the basis of the judgment, any amendment which takes away the basis of the judgment is not necessarily overruling the courts, it's only clarifying the law. So this is that loophole which the Rajiv Gandhi government used, but that then set another sorry precedent. It set the precedent that if a Supreme Court judgment was inconvenient or was not liked, governments had the power to overrule the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court then did not go further into the matter. It accepted the power of Parliament to do so. And in my view, it caused a certain consensus that at the most courts could only state the law. Courts could not necessarily do the right thing all the time. And if a government was minded to do the wrong thing, that courts could at best beat their ineffectual wings like a luminous angel. This is to just draw a metaphor from poetry. It also shaped another message that if the majority of, or any majority within any particular section of the community desired that the law could be changed or the law could be bent despite a court ruling, then that too could happen. We after the Rajiv era, then we entered into an era of coalitions. And this is where the courts then again expanded. And when they expanded, they again came out with interventions like the Jain Hawala case. They came out with interventions in the in the Mandal case. The years of coalition again saw the courts taking over one very important role. That was the role of appointing fresh judges. Up till then, what used to happen was that judges would be appointed by the government after consultation with the judiciary, and that once they became judges, they were expected to be pretty neutral umpires. However, in this era of coalition governments, the Supreme Court said that no, you do not only consult us, you must have our concurrence, and our concurrence will be decisive. So the power of replicating the judges or appointing fresh judges was taken over by the judiciary, and that became part of a kind of article of faith within the judiciary, that it would that independence of the judiciary demanded that judges appoint themselves. This too, to my mind, was a self-inflicted blow that the judiciary imposed on itself. If they didn't have the power of appointment, then the blame for bad judges would not necessarily rest on the judiciary. What happened is that through a series of constitutional maneuvers, the judiciary took over the power of self-perpetuation, and you later had what is called the collegium system, where the senior-most judges appointed judges at the High Court level or even to the Supreme Court. To take a cricketing metaphor, it is as if the Indian cricket team could select itself or its successors. So imagine if Virat Kohli could say that I want only these people and I do not want the others. So naturally, all the gharanas, the various cliques and all did get an overwhelming representation in appointments, and to my mind, the problem has been that as a result of the collegium, we have too many appointments of people like us. You have to be a lawyer in good standing, you have to hope that people in good standing approve of you, and that you catch the eye of a particular senior advocate or a particular judge who thinks that it's not a bad idea that you are appointed as a judge. So this tends to make the judiciary largely middle class, successful lawyers, many of them who have been government lawyers, and it has brought in a great series of conformists. The collegium system has also taken away any possibility of somebody like a Justice Krishna Iyer being appointed. Justice Krishna Iyer was one, as many of you know, was one of the great judges of the Supreme Court. But he had come into the judiciary after having been a minister in the EMS Namboodiripad government, thereafter going back into law practice, served for a few years as a judge of the Kerala High Court, then was brought up to Delhi as a member of the Law Commission by Mohan Kumar Mangalam, who was then the law minister, and he was to be appointed to the Supreme Court. But in the meanwhile, Mohan Kumar Mangalam died in an air crash. But despite that, he was brought in. Again, it was a search for a committed judiciary. But notwithstanding the commitment to economic justice of those times, it was Justice Krishna Iyer, along with Justice Bhagwati and later Justice Chinnappa Reddy, who were to lay the foundation for an expansion of our fundamental rights. After the coalition years, we then go back to the early years of the first NDA government, where by and large the courts and the executive had a reasonable equation, except with regard to the 2002 riots, where the then Chief Justice V.N. Khare, actually cross-examined the Chief Secretary of Gujarat in the first court of the Supreme Court. There were relatively fewer clashes. Until we again come back to the Manmohan Singh years, and in the Manmohan Singh years, the first 5 years saw not too much of a conflict, and it was the 2G scam and the court's intervention in it which played a dominant role in the fall of the UPA government. During those days, it was also seen that the Supreme Court of those days went further into economic questions than it had hitherto done. In 2G, as a consequence of finding the process flawed, they actually cancelled telecom licenses. That had a huge international impact. India was not seen as a safe destination. Courts could overturn settled contracts, and that kind of criticism did go back to the judges. Around that time, I had a conversation with Mr. Falinaraman, who's recently passed away, and the onset of a new majoritarian government was there for everybody to see. And he told me that, look, a majority government will see a conformist judiciary. And now, we come to the last 10 years. Through the last 10 years, we have had several instances where the judiciary has conformed or been more than willing to go along with the government. The instances that Mr. Dattanaik asked, Article 370, Rafale, Ayodhya, all those are judgments where the court was more or less in accordance with what the government wanted. But it was not as if these judgments came out of the air. They came in also with the courts broadly adopting the majoritarian consensus. Since Mr. Dattanaik asked about Ayodhya, it is it is necessary to state that the Supreme Court did a very careful balancing act in Ayodhya. What it said was that both sides had proved their case for a decree. Both the Hindu side and the Muslim side had shown that there was worship at that site of their respective religions. It also said that no mosque was demolished, no temple was demolished to build a temple, to build a mosque there. Because the last structure which the archaeological survey showed was at least 200 years before the Babri Mosque was built in the 1500s. It therefore said that look, both sides have proved their case, we will give both sides decrees. But now let us take our special powers under 142 and end this controversy once and for all. So we will push the participants apart. Since the Hindu side wants this property, we will give twice the property at another location to the Muslims. This was a carefully constructed judgment, tried to do a balancing act between both, and it was also possibly based upon the mediation efforts that the court had ordered a team of mediators to do. The mediators had come out with a similar plan, and parties to the dispute had almost agreed. But at the last minute, some people felt that nobody could sign away God's property and refused to sign it, and therefore what was perfectly all right as a mediatory exercise then became an adjudicatory award, and that is where the Supreme Court may have succeeded in one way as far as ending a dispute is concerned, but it failed to set an example which would satisfy everyone and satisfy the interests of the country in setting all other disputes. Because what the public has taken away from the Ayodhya judgment is that yes, you can always push somebody aside and you can build your place of worship. So what should have stopped at Ayodhya has now spread to Mathura, to Varanasi, to Kashi, and there are other things on the horizon. So this is where I would think that the current Supreme Court has, given its long history, given its desire to try and balance things and saying yes, the fault lies on both sides. Given its a very picturesque description by Professor Mark Gallanter, who said that the Indian judiciary's idea of justice is that when two people are fighting over a 100-rupee note, to tear it in half and give each person one half. So the Supreme Court, with its history, with its vision, and with its desire not to unnecessarily get into controversy, often ends up not only replicating the controversy, but extending it further. It is this failure of the imagination where the courts have possibly failed. It is in its failure to nip things in the bud or not to start things that courts have failed. To give you a personal example, I was taking a journalist to see the Humayun's tomb. Across from the Humayun's tomb is the police station. And she told her son, look, you see that police station? During the emergency, your daddy was taken there. Because the father was a famous politician and was a student of JNU at that point of time, had been detained during the emergency. I often have an unscientific test. I tell my juniors the same story and say that, now just imagine that I am in that police station and that you have filed a petition. Now let's go from quote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tell me which of them will give you relief. And that's that is a test. Which of these people, they are good people, they are good lawyers. They are lawyers who have come from the same community, the same gharana. Which of these men and women of law will stand up and say, that is not right? There, I often think that these men and women of law sometimes say, repeat that quote from Hamlet, the time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever was I born to set it right. Today, we have two chief ministers. One chief minister who just resigned short of arrest, and a sitting chief minister in prison. We have elections upon us. We have crucial questions which will be agitated before the courts over the next month or so. And at that point of time, what are the court's answers likely to be? The court, as I have told you, courts often depend upon the character of the Chief Justice of the day. There have been Chief Justices who, when faced with habeas corpus during the days that 370 were abrogated, said, why do you want to go to Kashmir? It's so cold there. There have been Chief Justices who have refused to list matters. And there have been Chief Justices who have, Chief Justices or other judges, who have at the right point of time made the right call. The current Chief Justice has shown some courage, specifically with regard to the electoral bonds, with regard to the elections in the Chandigarh mayoral election, and the court has possibly recognized that we are living not in ordinary times. This is a time when courts are required to do much more than merely state the law. The question is, after the elections, when a majority government, if a majority government comes in, will it be a conformist judiciary or an over-conformist judiciary? We place great trust in those who adorn those high offices. But are we worshipping false gods? Are we putting on them a burden of our own failures? It is very rare that a court goes much ahead of public opinion. I think the correct analogy or the correct sequence of events that Indian courts need to consider is the experience of our neighbors. Our neighbors had some very good judges at the time of partition. Justice Muhammad Munir was one of the sharpest legal minds there was. Yet, when the army took over there, he invented what was called the doctrine of necessity and justified army rule. And the judges of those times in a neighboring country went on defending various things that the government did, including the hanging of a former prime minister. But the same judges or the same judiciary was also responsible for the bringing down of Pervez Musharraf, a military dictator, after about 10 years as dictator of Pakistan. That was when the lawyers of the country came out on the streets. We are possibly not yet at that stage. But if we keep quiet, if we simply think that, we shall watch the news and let the news keep happening, and that the Constitution is just a document for lawyers to quibble over, that is where the courts will fail you and you will have failed the courts. Essentially, we have to go back to reclaiming the Constitution. The Constitution is not only a book for government. It is a social compact between citizen and citizen. It is a contract which says that we Indians shall live in fraternity, that we shall respect each other's individual choice, whether it be of food, whether it be of religion, and that any government that is a constitutional government will be a limited government. That governments will be of laws rather than of men. Maybe that is an idealistic formulation, especially in a country where the architect of its constitution, whose birth anniversary falls tomorrow, Dr. Ambedkar, warned us that while bhakti is good in religion, or maybe a source of salvation, in politics it leads to degradation and eventual dictatorship. This is a moment where if the country continues on bhakti, the courts can only then provide accompanying music. It is when the country turns skeptical, when the country questions authority and says, look, this can't be because I have my rights, I have my constitution, I have this compact between Indian and Indian. That is when the country will not have failed the courts, and the courts will not have failed the country. I thank you all for a very patient hearing.